Today on the Roundhouse, we're learning about how the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad is coming back to life. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 124 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby, you name it, and we discuss it. Today, I'm really pleased to be part of announcing this incredible news to you guys. The Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad in Washington State is coming back. A tourist railroad dedicated to logging history that has been in operation between 1980 and 2020, shut down for COVID. Now there is a plan to get it back into operation, and we'll be talking with Bethan, Maher, the executive director for Western Forest Industries Museum, about what that plan is going to look like. Before we get to that, though, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to today's episode and remind you that there's 123 other episodes of this podcast that you can check out on theroundhousepodcast.com. So welcome aboard. And if you like what we do here on the podcast, I encourage you to go to patreon.com/theroundhouse and support the show for even as little as $1 a month. There's all sorts of benefits, and I really appreciate your contributions to the show. Our guest today is the executive director of Western Forest Industries Museum. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mrs. Bethan Maher.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
It's so great to have you on the show. Congratulations. This is an exciting time for you guys. I'm really happy to hear all about what you have in store, as I'm sure those of you listening along today are as well. But let's start with an overview. What is the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad?
Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad is a logging railroad that's built on the old Milwaukee Road, Tacoma Eastern. Runs from Tacoma, Washington, further south into timber country. And it's a steam railroad. We've got a huge collection of geared locomotives and logging equipment on site. It's a 6-mile run right now between Elbe and Mineral, sort of on the gateway to Mount Rainier National Park. And it's really a unique historic railroad in that it's industrial, and that's always been the history of it. It's a little different from the East Coast where I originated from.
And it seems to me that for Washington State, timber was such a key component of the industry. Way back in 2015, we interviewed people talking about the last logging railroad that was in commercial service all the way up to 2015. So it's clear that timber's been a key element of the economy for several decades and well over a century there.
Yeah, it still is, but really the railroad was built part of the Wild West in Washington and Oregon, when Tacoma was the city of destiny, and the last outpost of quote unquote civilization in the United States. There was a lot of prospecting and really colorful stories. I think a lot of the ideas and imagery and romance about railroads and the characters they attract is very, very much embodied in Mount Rainier.
So this was an old Milwaukee Road branch. What led to the formation of the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad way back in 1980?
In 1980, the railroad had gone under, and I think that's the story of a lot of railroads and heritage railroad museums at that time. And Tom Murray was a logging businessman who had grown up, around railroading, around logging, and he saw with the railroad's bankruptcy that a lot of the equipment and the assets were basically going to fall into disuse. So he worked with Weyerhaeuser to create a small little section of railroad and a museum site in Mineral to basically house equipment. And I think I wasn't around then, but a lot of the volunteers and folks I've talked to in the town sort of said that he just started acquiring equipment without necessarily a plan because he just wanted to save it. So he knew he had to put it somewhere. And then a volunteer operation was formed to restore equipment, get it working again, and then eventually tourist excursions, and Mount Rainier Scenic was born.
And quite a collection it is. When people think of logging railroads, they think of the Trinity, having the Climax, the Shay, and the Heisler. You have those, plus you have a Willamette, which is sort of like a Shay, if you're not familiar with it. You've got rod engines, Mikados. You even have a Minaret, which is a saddle tank 282 steam locomotive. So you have this really cool assortment of equipment and, of course, equipment like steam donkeys to support logging. But I'm curious, Bethan, of all the engines in the collection, do you have a particular favorite?
You've asked me this question before, and my answer is the Willamette. And the reason for that isn't necessarily because it's, the sexiest steam engine out there, if such a thing exists. But I didn't have a background in steam when I moved to Washington, and it was such an interesting project to watch my mechanics and machinists who are just brilliant and really craftsmen and artists figure out how to get this thing operational again and put it back together. And I mean, they were working off of old drawings that were 60, 70 years old to get all the timing on the valves done. And it was just the process and the evolution of watching them get this locomotive working again, because it was really pretty different than the work that was being done to the other locomotives, because we knew how to do that work. And one of my machinists, I remember him saying, well, the only guys that have worked on this are staring down at me from above, just laughing because they know I'm doing it absolutely wrong. So I'm going to try every wrong way and then hopefully I'll find the right one. And I really connected with that process because it was, so much of what we do, we talk about living history. And it really was. It was just figuring it out with no instruction manual, no YouTube video to watch and, hey, how do I do this? What's the DIY project here? And it was just so cool to see it running again and know that it's the only operable one in the world. I mean, they only made them for 7 years. There's only a few of them in existence, and that one's the only operable one. So that's my personal connection to the two.
And that makes sense. That is certainly a unique piece of equipment. As a guy who was born and raised in Northwestern PA, I feel like I have to say my favorite's the Climax, number 10, but the Minaret is growing on me a great deal. And because you have such interesting equipment, not just in that it's steam, which is interesting alone, but because it's so unique, has that presented challenges when it comes to running not just a tourist railroad, and not even just a steam tourist railroad, but a steam tourist railroad that's using such an eclectic mix of locomotives?
Yes. That's the short answer. Yes. It's very cool to have a collection where each piece of equipment is different. It's also a nightmare to maintain, because nothing works the same way, nothing goes together the same way. And even from the storytelling perspective of a museum is how do you make sense and explain why these big pieces of metal sitting here are important and cool and what's their historical context in this railroading world. Logging railroads were really, I don't want to say junkyards, but it was sort of the dregs of the railroad world. They were built, they weren't necessarily made to last. And logging companies, were created and went under, and they were very transient in nature. And I think the equipment in the collection of equipment we have reflects that. It's not one nicely curated collection in a museum. It's a little bit of everything. And this was from here and that was from there. But I actually think that rings really, really true to the history of logging railroads in the West.
For rail fans, obviously, the difference between these different types of locomotives is gigantic, hence why we have our favorites amongst this diverse collection. I'm curious what the general public's perception has been, though. Do you, from your experience that you've had before the railroad shutdown in 2020, do you have a sense that they were able to appreciate the differences between these technologies? And how is something getting a little ahead into the future? How is that something that you want to bring to the forefront, is all these different mechanical approaches to solving the similar problem of hauling logs and lumber out of this region?
Perhaps being a little bit self-reflective and critical of the museum, done through a lens of desire to make it better. I don't necessarily know that we've done a great job explaining why these big pieces of metal matter and why they're unique and why they're different. The general public, I think, a steam engine is a steam engine. There's big ones and there's small ones. And so much of I think the feelings and the romance and exhilaration and excitement of railroads are, it's hearing the whistle and the clickety clack and this, seeing the steam and sort of and feeling it. But I don't think that the average family or tourist visiting the museum has a whole lot of care or understanding for the variety of locomotives. What I think matters in the context of the museum and what we're trying to do is telling the story of people that worked along the railroad, that worked on the railroad, that were affected by the railroad. And I think that's where I really see folks connect with the museum and the equipment, is when you get into the personal stories of life in logging camps. And it's something to see, a family come out with usually, a grandfather and grandkids, and he remembers his dad, working for a timber company or working for the railroad, and seeing those connections for me are what make the equipment in the museum matter.
So let's take a look at what the future can potentially hold. Formed in 1980, railroad ran for 40 years. And then in the spring of 2020, the announcement came that the railroad was shutting down due to COVID and the challenges associated with that. And that definitely sent shockwaves through at least the rail fan community. I saw people talking about that across the country because yours is such a well-respected institution. What led to the formation of Western Forest Industries Museum?
So, Western Forest Industries Museum is actually the nonprofit that's run the railroad since 1980. And what happened when American Heritage Railways, the operators of Great Smoky and Durango Silverton, they came in 2015, 2016, and basically assumed control of the railroad and did a lot to increase event revenue and increase the number of customers, changing the business model and the focus, working on branding of the railroad. So WIFM was dormant for a bit, and then when American Heritage was no longer able to operate the railroad, aside from the changing world of COVID, it was a really, really significant blow to the local communities. I mean, LB has, I don't know, I think it's a population of 30 or 40 people. That's the town we were departing from. And Eatonville, the next closest town, is not exactly a metropolis. So the railroad shutting down, those effects were really felt. I mean, we had about 250 seasonal employees, and I think I know half of the kids in the high school because they worked on the Polar Express. And the economic impact to the town of, suddenly you're not spending $40,000 on cookies. That has an effect on the bakeries and the local shops. And I think it was really jarring for folks to not hear the whistle and the train coming through. And I've had a lot of people say to me that they didn't realize sort of how embedded in the fabric of their lives that was, and that they knew it was Memorial Day weekend because all of a sudden they were hearing the train again. Their sort of cycle of life was reflected by the railroad. The impact to the town and the local community was really significant, and then I think it really rocked the railroad world a little bit, because like you said, Mount Rainier has been an institution, in many ways, and, it was incredibly tough shutting it down, and I remember just spending hours talking with staff as, I was laying everyone off and terminating employment and saying, "Okay, like, what do we need to do to the equipment to preserve it? Is anyone gonna be on the site? How are we gonna protect it? Do we need to take the whistles out of the engines? And, what are we gonna do to try and maintain the collection, and the integrity of it and ensure that it's not vandalized?" And that was really the world we were in, is we didn't think it was gonna come back. In American Heritage, it said they were really dedicated to finding a new owner, but 2020 was a wild year. There wasn't a lot of hope, so it was a little bit heartbreaking, more than a little bit. Shutting the railroad down and seeing people in the store and in town and asking what was happening and what was going to happen to the collection, and getting the occasional message saying like, "Hey, are they gonna sell the railroad piece by piece?" And as a rail fan and existing in this world, it's really a sinking feeling in your gut when you start having those conversations.
That's true that when you're talking about the people impact and this being a story of people, it's so easy to think about honoring the legacy of those before. And obviously, that's a key element of these stories. But there's the present, there's all of these supporting elements that go into making a tourist railroad function, and how much, especially for a smaller community such as Elby and Eatonville, that is a cornerstone, whether people recognize it or not. The absence of that, it's clear that that's been felt, and the amount of bonds and relationships that develop through that. Hopefully, though, now that there is a sunrise on the horizon, because those bonds exist, that is, I imagine, a key element of what's being able to power this rebirth of the railroad.
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing happens without people trying. There were a lot of folks that really wanted to see the railroad come back. Some myself, former employees, the county, the town, were all really interested, in what was going to happen to the railroad. And Eatonville elected a new mayor, Dave Boblitz, in, I think it was 2022, this year. And he was sort of looking at some of the challenges in the town and job creation and infrastructure, and what does the town need to not survive but thrive and be a vibrant community. How do we capitalize on the tourists that we know are driving through the town but maybe aren't stopping? What do we do to help lift our community? And one of the answers he kept coming back to was the railroad. There have been a lot of other players. The Mount Rainier National Park is just absolutely gorgeous, but the infrastructure of the park is challenging, particularly during the summer years. I mean, the visitation for the park has increased year over year, and they have a really challenging time with the number of cars and the number of people coming into the park. They're concerned about the impact on the local area. There isn't really a true gateway area to the park that there are at some other national parks. The Grand Canyon is one that probably the whole railroad world is familiar with, but you have a welcome center there, and the infrastructure is built to support the number of tourists going into the national park. Whereas with Mount Rainier, it's not the case. So what can we do to relieve some of the pressure on the park? What can we do to work on busing people into the park? Are there other attractions that can maybe give customers a beautiful view of the mountain and a feel for the outdoors and the history and the ecology of the area? So the park sort of said, well, the railroad could be an answer to some of these, or at least could contribute to helping some of these challenges. And actually talking with the Nisqually tribe, the railroad is built through former Nisqually villages, and in a lot of ways, the reason the railroad and the town of Eatonville are there is because the Nisqually tribe was there. And we can get into, I'm sure we will, a whole lot of the history of settlement and railroads and the impact on displacing people. But the tribe right now is really interested in doing ecological work and ecological preservation. And one of their missions is community revitalization, and in working with towns, particularly rural communities, within their territory, within their area. So they have an interest in the railroad. Obviously, Pierce County economic development, we're in the same county as Tacoma, but it's a really interesting county in that you have a major urban area that sort of goes to really, really rural areas in that gateway area to the national park. And they're saying, listen, there's not a whole lot happening in the southern portion of the county without the railroad. And we've seen this huge dip in tourists and, hotel room nights in the area. And what do we need to do? And then obviously the town of Eatonville, we've talked about moving the railroad into Eatonville, where the rail line goes, and building a larger depot there for years. And I think it was sort of said, listen, we keep talking about it. What do we need to do to make it happen? And all of those forces sort of converged. And I started maybe giving some opinions on how I would like to see it done. And here we are trying to do the thing again.
There's all these conversations going on, people making noises about the railroad. But for you, Bethan, what was the firing pin moment? What was the, okay, we're going to do this? What is the moment that it became clear that this went beyond just nebulous talk to a specific plan of action?
The answer my husband would give was probably the first day I sat at home and didn't go to work for a railroad and went, so this is life. That would be his answer. My answer would sort of be, I kept getting some phone calls saying, can we ask your advice? And I really cared about it. And I've maintained really good friendships with the employees that were working for me. And obviously, we've talked a lot about what we would like to see happen with the collection. And so they sort of started asking some questions. And then Mayor Boblitz called a few times and said, what would you do about this? And then at one point, I think my husband was hiking and I was in an RV with our probably 10-month-old at the time. And it was 10 o'clock at night. And I poured myself a glass of scotch and spent about 5 hours writing a business plan just to get it out, right? Because I needed to do it. And once I got it on paper, it'd be done. But, that's sort of that's funny. So, it was this is how I would do it. This is how I think it needs to be done. These are some new ways we can look at the railroad, new things we can do. This is how I would phase the reopening. These are the folks I would partner with. Yeah, 6 months later, here I am. And I am working on executing that plan.
The Strasburg Railroad is an institution in the heritage railroad industry, and its Mechanical Services Department is proud to lead the way. With the knowledge and experience that has created one of the most reliable steam railroading experiences in the country, the Strasburg Railroad is excited to offer their expertise to the rest of the industry. Strasburg's professional team provides consulting and technical assistance to take your steam locomotive or railcar project from idea to finished product. They stand behind their work and always strive to meet their customers' needs for quality, historic accuracy, and reliability at a price that is fair. Unlike many competitors, they feature a fully equipped boiler, railcar, and machine shop, so the work gets done in-house, helping you to get more for your money. Send your inquiries to mechanical@strasburgrailroad.com and let the professionals get to work for you. As we sit here and talk in September of 2022, what is the overview of that plan?
Sure. We have a 4-phase plan essentially to reopen the railroad. And this is the part where I might disappoint some rail fans and say we're probably not going to be running excursions in 2023. I'm sorry. It is absolutely our intent to get the railroad running and operational. But this railroad, much like its history in the logging roads, has really been cobbled together a number of times. And I don't think that in its history, the management has sort of taken time to say, okay, this is what we need to do. These are the building blocks we need to have in place to make sure that this is sustainable, that it's self sustaining, and that it's done in a way that it's going to be viable for the next however many decades and hopefully 100 years. And I am very, very concerned and insistent that we go about doing this in a way that is very, very thoughtful. That's not to say to take a ton of time debating. I absolutely believe in action, but we need funding in place. We've got 1472s, for example, coming up on some of our equipment. And I don't want to start operating a railroad just to have to take an engine out of service in 9 months. That's going to end up costing us a lot more money. And in my mind, it makes sense to let's do that now. Let's get the building blocks in place, and then let's start moving. So we've got a phased approach. And phase one is starting a rail bike operation, doing rail cycle Mount Rainier, which is going to depart from Park Junction and go to the museum in Mineral. So that's going to help us start with, getting tourists interested, providing something new for them to do and see and experience. I think it's going to be a really, really, it's a beautiful, beautiful ride. I mean, you go over the Nisqually Bridge and you've just got a stunning 80-foot high trestle with a view of Mount Rainier. And I get really excited and worked up about it because it's stunning. And then, you get to hang out at the museum, and our steam locomotives get to have visitors again. And the logging camp, can serve its purpose there, and actually be a museum. And then we'll shuttle people back. So phase one is a rail bike operation. And that accomplishes a few things for us. Like I said, it gets tourists there, gives a little purpose to the museum. It also allows us time to get some of our business practices in place, start hiring again, form some of those partnerships, work with the town. So that's phase one. And while we're operating and opening up the rail bike operation, we're also, the beauty of being a nonprofit is that we get to apply for grant funding. So right now we are working on some federal grant applications to do some engineering and feasibility studies, planning studies on a few different locations in Eatonville where we can build a new depot, and what work needs to be done to the track and the bridges and to restore that section of track to get it operational again. So while we're opening the rail bike operation, which is going to hopefully provide enough operating capital, it should, to start some of the railroad restoration work. We need to rebuild a volunteer program. We need to get our business practices in place. And we're going to be really aggressively pursuing grant funding in conjunction with the town and the county, likely the tribe and the park as well. Phase two is actually beginning to implement those studies and those findings. That's resuming railroad operations. It's really phase 2 and 3. But, working on our steam engines. I think most of the folks listening to this podcast know that boiler work isn't necessarily quick or cheap. So we need to do it. We need to make sure that we've got at least 3 operational steam engines. I'd like to have 4, and the rail fans can think about that one, but I have pipe dreams and plans for getting one more engine online and operational. So starting railroad operations again, I would love to reopen from Eatonville, from a new location there, just so that we have a longer ride. And the ride from Eatonville to Elby, that track is really, it's pretty rolling farm country. It's also very scenic, and it's a nice, it really sort of takes you through history. It's in all of those cliches that we talk about, but it takes you from the more settled rural farming area really into the wilderness of Mount Rainier and the park and the logging area. So I think a longer ride is going to allow us to do a little bit more on board. It's going to allow us to change up our events a little bit. And I think it's really going to be better for customers, is then, they'll be able to stay in town and have somewhere to eat and grab a drink and all of those things. And then the final phase is we would like to do a lot of work on actually constructing a new museum. And that's a big ask, and I'm really, really passionate about it being done. The museum right now it has good bones. The equipment is incredible, and it's really diverse. It represents a really good just cross section of logging and railroading. But what the museum doesn't do is tell stories of the people, the people that worked on the railroad, the people that worked along the railroad. There aren't personal stories that are told, and I think the museum leaves a lot of history out. So I think it's fair to say that we can do better with the museum, and we need to do better. We need to tell a more inclusive, contextualized history of railroading in this area and really in the country, because the development of railroads mirrors and echoes so much of the history of the development of the country. And it's a lot of the museum now is a lot of glorification. And that's okay, because some of the engineering work that was done and the just sort of the feats of just sheer will are incredible. But it doesn't do a great job of telling some of the bad and the ugly. So we need to tell the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'm really passionate about doing that.
That was one of the things that really intrigued me when you told me about this initiative, is the fact that among your supporters are the Nisqually. Given that there's historically, going back 150 years, been more of an antagonistic relationship between the railroad and Native Americans, the fact that there's a willingness to cooperate with a present day railroad to A, cover that history appropriately, and B, use the benefits of a railroad for not just education, but also ecological preservation, making sure that the wilderness is well maintained and to get cars off the road, as you were saying. I think that's really an interesting partnership.
Yeah. I mean, I think that not because it's the politically correct thing to do or anything like that, but it is incredibly important to acknowledge that, the Nisqually tribe were there first. The original prospectors that came through for the Northern Pacific Railroad, in their findings and in their journals, they mention Nisqually villages in Elby along the Mashel River and Skate Creek, which are all along the railroad. Eatonville is there because it's called Indian Henry. Sotolik, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation and I need to do better, was of Yakima descent, but lived among the Nisqually, and he was a guide for the first settlers that established Eatonville. So I don't think it's fair to separate out that history. And I think it's important that we tell the history of development within context of, why was the Nisqually tribe forcibly relocated? Well, it was because there is development and prospectors and money to be made in that area, and that's a fact, and we need to acknowledge it, and we also need to celebrate the fact that the cultural history and the heritage of the area goes back much further than the railroad. And I'm really, really, really pleased that the tribe is supportive of this project. And I'm looking forward to working with them, because quite frankly, I don't think I'm the best person to be telling their story. They can do it better than I can. And if we can help, then we should. And it's not for nothing. They're outside the tribe. There are a lot of other stories. I mean, there was a huge Japanese American presence in Japanese American logging camps in Eatonville and LB and Mineral in that entire area. And there's some actually fantastic photos and historic records. The cemetery in Eatonville has a large Japanese section that the graves stop in the late 30s and early 40s because those folks were all interned. Actually, in some cases, German prisoners of war replaced them working in logging camps. So that's not a history to be proud of, but it is the honest and true history of the railroad. Conditions for railroad workers are in logging camps. I mean, logging camp life was, I'm just talking and talking, but it's so interesting. Is logging camp life was really hard. It was hard, it was ugly. The railroads really took advantage of their employees, and script pay that they could only spend their earnings in the company store. So how do you mobilize? How do you move? Some of the foundations of the labor movement all originate in railroads. So I think that just in talking about the museum and the stories to tell, I think it's important to celebrate some of the amazing engineering, and it absolutely does not take away the feeling that we have when we are riding behind a steam engine. But let's contextualize it. Is why is the railroad here? Who did it affect? Who worked on it? One of my employees and a longtime volunteer, Tom, was doing work the other day, and he actually found a photo of his great grandfather that was taken in 1906, about a month before he disappeared and was never seen again, but working in a logging camp. And that's a real story that the folks around today are not that far removed from. So let's tell Tom's story and let's tell his great grandfather's story.
It's clear as you're describing this, Bethan, you're a visual thinker. I get the sense that as you're talking about this, you're seeing these stories in your mind and you're seeing what this is going to look like. For where we're at now in the process, what are some of the ways in which you could visualize bringing these stories out in the different phases, either through the museum as a complex and through the overall experience?
I'm gonna plug a local business for a minute, but Millhouse Cider, Millhouse in Eatonville, just opened recently. And they make hard cider, and they have really really good food. But their facility actually incorporates some of our scrap pile. They made their barbecue and their smoker out of railroad scrap. There's a steam whistle attached to it, which is sort of cool. A little nerdy, but sort of cool. And they've really used old logging equipment in mills and water wheels to design the landscaping of their whole place in it. But it's something that people can sit back and relax and have some really good food and a drink. And I don't think that a museum needs to be stuffy. I don't think it needs to be something that we can look at and not touch. I would love to, not for nothing, use our scrap pile and old gears to make benches and seats and have something that folks can interact with and have this really, really visible, tangible experience that people can sort of walk on and crawl over and touch. And we have photos of these logging camps. And in some cases, we even know who the folks in the photos were. So let's tell the story of that individual person. Let's have their story next to the picture of the piece of equipment they were operating. And I think that's a way to breathe life into this whole thing, but to connect it in a way that's both reflective of a modern audience and still preserves the history. Is, I would like to have a sort of active park in an area that people can walk around and enjoy. And there's probably some landscaping done around an old log mover, but why not? The stuff is really, really big for the most part. The fact of it is a lot of it is going to be a park-like setting. There's stuff we absolutely cover and climate control and protect and put in a building, but it is just not realistic to do that with everything.
All of this has me really, really excited. It makes me go, where do I sign up? And you probably are feeling the same way listening to this conversation too. And so, Bethan, how do people become involved in what you have going on?
Obviously, donations are always really, really welcome. And I would encourage anyone to check out our website, which is wfim.org. So definitely do that. Donations are very, very helpful. And actually, a lot of what donations do are help us leverage matching funds for grants. So it really makes your dollar donated go a lot further when we can apply for grants for museum projects, restoration projects. Those donations help us maximize the impact through grant dollars. And then, the other one is I really want to bring back the volunteer program. I think after AHR took over, they're a for-profit business. Their business model is different than the railroads was, and probably different than, well, undoubtedly different than what we're planning. But volunteers weren't necessarily the base of their operation. But in talking to folks in the town and so many people that have worked on the railroad, there's so much talent and so much passion there. So we're really planning on bringing back the volunteer program, and I'm hopeful that we'll get people interested. And I think we'll start a little bit slow with work parties on specific projects on site, but that's also we are looking at changing the museum's narrative and expanding it a little bit. So there's historical research that can be done and writing and storytelling. So there's a lot of help that doesn't need to be on site either for, some of real fans or folks from a sort of broader geographic area. I would love to incorporate some of that help because there's just so much talent and so much knowledge that exists in folks that are passionate about this. Volunteer programs can be challenging to manage and to run, but just because it's challenging doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And I think when you have folks that are passionate and knowledgeable and really dedicated, that energy it's absolutely contagious. And I think that when we're talking about reinventing and reimagining something and doing something new, maybe with something old, being able to capitalize on that energy it's an absolute gift.
You were saying earlier how one of your machinists was trying to work on this steam locomotive and knew that other people were looking down and making judgments and that he was hoping to get it right. And that illustrates this idea that history at the end of the day is preserved through people and sharing that. And so the fact that you are designing this volunteer program with that recognition that you're able to capitalize on people's enthusiasm and educate them, and then they're learning that history and also creating new history along the way, and that cycle continues. That's such a strong engine to have.
Thanks. I am one person, and there are so many people that are so much more knowledgeable than I am in most areas. I think that's safe to say. But when you have someone that really, really cares about something and is passionate about something, what a gift to be able to give back to the community and the museum, and what a way to honor the folks that have been there, and also just make it relevant and make it matter. The museum is something that should be living and breathing and evolving based on the people that are there now.
Your passion for this is evident, and I'm sure is contagious and helping to spread the enthusiasm of this. As I say, I want to, even though I'm all the way out in Virginia, I want to sign on the dotted line and make my way out to you guys. So that's great that you have so much to look forward to, and because you have so much to look forward to, at the end of the day, what are you most excited about when you're visualizing all of what's to come?
That's a really good question, and one I haven't necessarily thought of. The maybe a little bit foamy answer. My initial answer was just getting to be on a steam engine that's operating again. But I don't necessarily think that's the reason to do something. That's just my rail fan coming out. So last night I was at a town council meeting, and there was a gentleman there who was perhaps a bit more senior, and he was talking about how he and his brother used to work on the railroad in the 50s, and they would send cars in by shipping containers, and the cars were really wide, a little bit wider then, so they had a really hard time unloading them. And sometimes maybe after hours when they'd had a little bit of fun or something to drink, they would then go play on the railroad again, and got into trouble a few times because handbrakes aren't things that you release for fun. But, and is that really an awesome story? No, but I love seeing people connect with what we do. I think I was trying to think this morning about what the economic development is good, telling the history is good, building community is good. Those are all things that are incredibly important to me. But at the end of the day, why do I keep doing it? I think there's two reasons. Is one, it's the family that has a grandparent that they don't know what to get them for their birthday because man, they have everything. But a cab ride, like that's cool. That's a bucket list item. And being able to see, grandparents and grandkids connect over something that is both of the past and of the present. That is something I love. I miss my grandparents, and I think the end of my grandmother's life, she had dementia, so I was still working in New York at the time, and we were able to talk about the New York Central. That's a little different than managing the Adirondack Scenic, but she still remembered all of the places and all of the things. And I think, that living memory and being able to bring it to life and see those personal connections is just really, really, really special. And, I don't know if it's selfishly or not, but working a train and, if I'm the conductor or I'm stepping down off an engine, sort of watching a little girl's face as they go, huh, she's doing that. Wow, that's another girl doing that. And I think maybe telling stories of people and telling a little bit wider, more inclusive story of people, I think I'm hopeful will bring more people into railway preservation, and make it a little bit more of a diverse and inclusive area, because there is something just really cool and really empowering about saying, you know what, like I can operate a lathe. I mean, I can't do that well, but there's no reason that I can't and I couldn't become better. And breaking down some of those barriers, I think, is something that's also really special to me.
The more people we get to share what we love with, the better, because then more people are foaming it up as we are.
Yeah, and it's wild. My kid is not quite a year and a half now, and last time I was managing a railroad, I didn't have a kid. So knowing that I'm going to be able to bring Martin to the railroad and he's going to see his mom work on a railroad, like that's something I can be proud of.
The website is wfim.org, and shameless plug time for myself. You have to check it out for all the reasons that Bethan's illustrated, but also because Streamliner Media, my company, produced the launch trailer for this wonderful initiative. You can see the video there, and I'm actually in the process of finishing it by the time we're recording this, so Bethan hasn't seen it, so hopefully it will turn out great.
I was about to say that it was awesome and that, we were excited to do this, but honestly, we're recording this podcast a few days before the news is going to be released, so.
Exactly. We're all excited to see how this turns out, but you guys can go see it at wfim.org. You can see the launch trailer, you can read all about the initiative, and find out how you can become part of this. Bethan, thank you so much for joining us here on the Roundhouse.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for listening. It means a lot if you've hung on this far and listened to the story, so thank you.
And now, the question of the day.
Your question of the day for this episode is actually, you get a choice of one of the two questions. If you've been to the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad previously, what was your experience like? And if you haven't, what is your favorite logging locomotive? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. We have links to social media there and all these other episodes for you to enjoy. Thank you so much for listening today, guys. I love having you along for the ride when we get to have really cool announcements and discoveries like today. Remember, as always, that the Roundhouse is our house.